So let's continue with this tutorial series where we're following the Apple tutorials, and today we're going to be learning on how to pass data between views, I think they said. So you will create a new view containing controls to edit Scrum. So if you propose all the standard controls for iOS apps, you will add a slider, a text field, and a color picker. Then you will add the data view to present your new edit view. So maybe we don't touch data yet. We'll see. So update the data model. Before you create an edit view, create a new data type inside daily Scrum. Data will contain all the editable fields as 0 digits. Okay. Type. So we go on daily Scrum. And you want me to define an X. Wait, what? Ah, so you make a nested. Yeah, when they were talking about data type, I was confused because, I mean, it's kind of a weird name to give. It makes sense, but it conflicts with the data on Foundation. From the standard library? No, I think it's Foundation. But of course, that's why you nest it inside daily Scrum so the namespaces don't conflict. Again, they don't explain any of this, but whatever. That's why I'm here. User adjust the meeting length with a slider view because sliders work with double values, so that's this one. You define length in minutes as double, perfect. Making data nested type, you keep daily Scrum distinct from the data structure. Oh, so they explain it. Yes, see? Very nice, very nice. I like, you see, like, I'm reading and from the tutorial I'm seeing ideas and I'm explaining my ideas and stuff like that, and then sometimes they are reflected on the tutorials, like in this one, which is super good because I think it's really important to drop these nuggets of knowledge, but sometimes it's not. So it's nice, it's nice. I don't have major complaints for now. So we can assign default values to all properties. If all properties have default values, the compiler creates an initializer that takes no arguments. Perfect. Yep, cool. So I'm just gonna copy again because I don't want to waste much time just writing things that are already in the tutorial without learning anything from them. Which I think it's one of the reasons why I don't like this way of learning. You know, I prefer like kind of a more passive way of learning that lets me just get the input of everything. Add a computed data property that returns data with the daily Scrum property values. Okay. Remember to cast limit to double, all other properties have matching type. Okay. So now this is so from a daily Scrum, we can create a data. And I'm just gonna use the new syntax that makes return redundant in this scenario. And if we remember correctly, length in minutes is an int, but because this is gonna be used in the UI with a slider, we need to use it as a double because that's what the slider works with. It's a way of converting the types, hiding it from the UI layer. Okay, that's nice. That is nice. And all of these are bars, which it's gonna get important later, and we create. Okay, perfect. Let's continue. So now we add an edit view from the Scrum details. In this section, you will create the edit view and add controls for modifying the title, length, and color of the Scrum. You will store the changes to the Scrum data property. Oh, and now it's when we start seeing how SwiftUI manages data and state and all that stuff. So you will define a user property state wrapper because you need to mutate the property from within the view. And explains how SwiftUI observes the state properties to automatically re-render the screen. Perfect. So everything stays in sync. Amazing. So let's start with interesting. So create a SwiftUI view called edit view. Let's make an edit view. Put the file here. I hate how they all go. I said here, thank you very much. And now we add a state property for Scrum data. So we go here, we use this property wrapper. I think it's a private var state daily Scrum data. Wait, what? And we're just creating fake one for now, I guess. Because I will imagine we inject this from the outside, but for now I guess we make a... Each page of data that you use, your view hierarchy should have a single source of truth. You can use the state property wrapper to define a source of truth for value types. Cool. Declare state properties as private so they can be accessed only within the view in which you define them. Yeah, useful tips. Pretty cool. Okay. So now, yeah, we're kind of doing again the same thing we did just on the previous tutorial, where we define a list, but a list that uses static views, so statically defined list, to make a nice screen, which I really like. So now the section, we just do this, and we have now a text field here. And if you look at this, that's how you make forms in SwiftUI, and you can see how so painful it is. Like how easy it is and how painful it is in UIKit compared with. It's amazing. Let's try again. Cool. Nice. I think they fucked up here because this is clearly a navigation, but they haven't told us. You can see they haven't told us to put this in navigation view. If we do it, so that's not what the tutorial says, but if we do it, we'll see how now this example matches this. So they have kind of like a step that they missed, but it's fine. So here it's the first time we see the bindings. So it's saying that the text for the text field expects a binding to a property, and tells you how to define a binding just by using the $sign in front of basically a property that it's bindable. Nice. So now you add an H tag and a slider for the meeting length in the slider label closure and a text view for the accessibility. Slider stores a double from a continuous range that you specify. So the continuous range is from 5 to 30. So having a 30 minutes standard, my god, that's a standard in many places. And basically the slider, when you modify the slider, is going to use this binding to update this piece of state here. Okay. So we can do this. No, you want it on the same section, correct? So let's put it here. Okay. Note that the text won't appear on the screen, but VoiceOver uses to identify the purpose of the slider. That's cool. And on macOS, I'm pretty sure that if you use this exact same view on macOS, the text shows up on the left, because that's the style of sliders on macOS. I'm pretty sure. So now we add a spacer and we basically show. So remember, like this, the same thing we did on the other views. It's an H tag and we add a spacer, so now we're going to be seeing this as a trailing. And because the slider tries to fill as much space as possible, you can see how the spacer is not visible like it is in the other views, because the slider fills as much space as possible. That's why. So now we add a color picker to pass the binding to the color. So that's the same. So color picker is this, of course, this new control that was added on iOS 14, which is super cool because it shows a full color picker on iOS, and you can basically use colors from there. And we pass it with initial color, so that's perfect. And now we add another section to the list to display the Scrum attendees, which is, I guess, this is more complex because you want to edit things. So in this section, you will display the attendees inside the edit view. You will support for adding and deleting users. That's cool. See how, like, little by little we're adding complexity. Like, if you think about this now, it's like, think about the whole thing. it's complex and maybe difficult to start, but when we have done step by step, it's not that hard. So we're gonna add a new section. So this section, so we add a new section here, and now it's gonna make attendees. Cool. Here, let's see how we do this. We make the UI for all of this. So we add a for each to display the attendee in the text view. This is exactly the same thing as before, except that before, if you remember from this, we were using a label. So this is basically the same thing we're doing now. So before we were using a label, which kind of clearly shows a nice UI for the final view. And in this case, we're just using a text. You know, I guess kind of to differentiate it, to be honest. If it was me, I would probably use the same UI. I don't see a reason not to. So that's the same thing as before. And now add an onDelete modifier to remove the attendees from the Scrum data. This framework calls disclosure you pass on delete when the user swipes to delete the row. So we do this bit here, and we can take a look at the code a little bit to see. So we are adding a modifier to the for each, which is, it's kind of nice because you are adding this kind of not declarative, because now we are running code on an event, so it's kind of like an imperative style of coding now, but you are kind of doing it as close as possible to the piece of data on the UI. So you're not adding on delete here some method and you don't know from where it comes from. You can directly do it as a modifier on the specific view, which is super powerful in terms of when you're reading the code and you want to keep the context of everything that's going on. So that's super interesting. So now we need to add a new piece of state. So that's likely gonna be to add a new one. Okay. So to add a new attendee, we add this piece of data to add the user enters, and after all the list of attendees, we add basically a text field to add a new one. Let's resume to see what we have done. You see, so it looks like we don't have any attendees, of course, because we're creating it an empty data. Like, if you want, I can show you how you can see attendees, and we can do this. And in theory, if I'm not mistaken, now we should see one attendee, and still I should see the field below it. You see? Perfect. But let's keep it like this because that's what the tutorial wants us to follow. And now, remember, because this is an H tag, we can add a button with just an image, nothing fancy, with a plus, which is what we are going to be triggering to add the name of the attendee, which it's been added into the field. Now it will be part of the list. So we see that the action is empty. Right now we're not doing anything, but now we need to add some code. So that's what we're going to be here. So to be honest, I would like to, like the tutorial, to tell you that you need to add this here as new attendee to see how this works, and then to tell you, oh, but you can make it really nice just by wrapping this in an animation block. You know, like to see clearly that adding animation to SwiftUI is super simple. So just with this, when we fill this text and we click, we are adding this on the list, automatically it's going to be rendered because the state is going to be changing, and we're going to see the name move up and leave this space here for emptying it. Well, not true, because we're not emptying the state. There you go. So we need to put an empty string into this variable, which is bound to the text field. So we see what I was saying, that the fact that the text field is going to be reset, ready to have new data. And of course, now finally, this button, we wanted to have it disabled, and this is kind of an if condition, like we want to disable it if new attendee is empty, I'm presuming. Exactly. So if new attendee is empty, we want the button to be disabled. And you can already see, because the default state has an empty string here, you can see how it's grayed out. So step 10, we do the same thing we did before. So we are using these inset grouped list styles, and we need to do it on the list. So if I'm not mistaken, this is the list. No, this is the section, this is the list. There you go. Very nice. So now we add some accessibility modifiers, which are very important, especially in forms. So we start with the slider. We add this modifier to basically make it easier to know what's going on, because we visually know that these two things are together, but it's much better if you read it properly as a sentence. So then now we can hide this, because basically we're reading this text on the trailing side. We're reading it as parts of the slider. All standard things for color picker. It doesn't tell you which color, because giving names to the colors is kind of tricky. And here we do this typical thing for the image, because otherwise the image will read as this, which of course not very, I mean, it's explanatory, but it doesn't read very nice. So that's it for the accessibility. Super, I keep repeating it, but it's super cool that they focus so much on accessibility on this kind of like starter tutorial. It's very, very nice, because it teaches newcomers to building SwiftUI apps already with accessibility in mind, and how easy it is. Like, nobody should not do it, you know. It's super, super nice. Now we need to present this view that we just created. So that's going to happen when the user taps on the edit button. And it's going to present it as a full screen model, which is different from the navigation hierarchy that we built before. So for that, we go into the detail view. Here we are. And we need to add a piece of state to basically hold a boolean that tells us if it's presented or not. If it's presented, we want to show this model, and if it's not presented, we want to not show it. Basically, that's how presentation works on SwiftUI. And for that, we add a full screen cover, basically a sheet, a presentation sheet on top of the current exit. When it's presented changes to true, we're going to modally present it, and when not, it's going to be dismissed. You can use the shed modifier to present a model that only partially covers the underlying content. View the human interface guidelines to learn more about using modality effectively in your apps, which is very important, because it's kind of the worst thing that many designers do when coming into iOS development, not mobile, iOS development, which is that iOS has a specific guidelines on how to use navigation in the applications, and in other platforms like Android or web, like this, it's different. You don't because on Android you don't have, for example, these animations when pushing content, which makes visually sense to the user that something is happening, that it gives a 3D context, a spatial context of where views are going and all that stuff. On Android, by default at least, just things kind of fade in and fade out. So what on Android is just make a new view, on iOS needs to be more thought. Make a new view and how we present it. What is this representing on this kind of like spatial context that our life, our application lives in. So it's very important that if you are starting to design an iOS application, you keep this in the frontmost of your design. Super, super important. Okay, but now we need some way of flipping this boolean, which we're gonna do with an edit button, navigation bar item, trailing, same thing we did before. So we can just do this here. And we should see the edit button in there. Perfect. And we're just switching this to true. And now, because this, it doesn't explain it here, which is kind of lame, to be honest. Yeah, would be nice if they explain this a little bit more, because the fact that you are presenting this edit view with basically a model presentation, it means that that model presentation is a new hierarchy. It's not the hierarchy that this view lives in. So if we want to do something in there or show navigations and stuff like that, we actually need to make a new navigation view hierarchy just for this, you know. That's why we're doing this, even though the tutorial doesn't explain it. But that's why we're doing this. And for example, you do this. So if you don't have this navigation view, this wouldn't do anything, basically, which is kind of lame. And navigation buttons that dismiss, edit, these buttons are identical actions. Yeah. So basically, like, it's interesting how they are adding all these titles and now we're adding these navigation var items, and they don't do it as part of the edit view like we're doing here. We're doing this detail view and we are adding all this navigation stuff here. But they decided on this case, instead of adding it on the edit view, which we have here, they decided to do it from the outside, which is an interesting decision nonetheless. Makes sense most of the time to do it like this, because you want this to be reusable in multiple parts. So now we're adding it, we're presenting it as a model cover, but in other occasions we may be pushing it or some other stuff and the UI will change, you know. So you know, you want to keep things as flexible as possible, although sometimes, especially in iOS, where you add buttons on navigation bars that don't belong to you but to your parent, it gets kind of convoluted, you know. And there is no universally a real solution that facilitates this kind of reusability. And to be honest, in SwiftUI, since you can modify things through the hierarchy with these modifiers, I will probably just put this inside the edit view and provide closures to these modifications, or even a binding, you know, which I think I have some blog posts on my blog of doing these kind of things from the betas when navigation and presentation was a lot harder, was more convoluted. So I added some extensions to this kind of thing, and precisely that was my mentality in there. You know, just provide the closures and I will internally do whatever I want to fulfill the contract, you know. In this case, we're doing this. But let's not derail and let's keep doing. So the edit view is nearly complete, but the changes aren't saved. You will add the code necessary to do it on the next tutorial. So before closing, I guess we can give it a run and see. Of course, it's not going to change, but we can see how the view interacts. And it's not going to change because, as we can see here, when the cancel and done button are executed, we just flip that flag, flip that boolean that just dismisses or presents the view, nothing else. So we go here, that's what we had before, but now we can edit this stand up and we have this view. But of course, when we do cancel and done, nothing changes. And that's just because we are just flipping the boolean, not getting this new data and saving it, which is the bulk of the work. So that's gonna be on the next tutorial. But we can see here how our data actually flips, and like in SwiftUI, when you bind things to data, if you don't do it correctly, you cannot write anything, you know? So this tells us that it's actually working. You know, like if we're binding it to something that was a constant, every time you click, you know, you're trying to modify that binded value, but it's constant, so you can't, so it re-renders the same thing that it was before because you didn't change it. But because it works, we know that we're actually touching it. And here we can see how we can change the color, and it modifies the color because it's a binding directly, so we don't have to save or anything. And as we were saying before, we can click here and it's animated and it adds everything in there. There you go. But when you cancel, nothing has changed here. So that's gonna be the next tutorial. But before that, let's check our understanding. How should you initialize a slider view that lets the user pick only the values 5, 10, 15, and 20? Okay, that's an interesting one. I don't think this exists. If it exists, maybe, I don't know. I think you just need to... it's this one or this one? You see, I think this is the first question on all these tutorials that I'm not 100% sure about. I'm not 100% sure because this syntax... It's this one or this one, I think. Let's submit this one. No, because the slider initialize doesn't take a from two parameters. Yeah, makes sense because it takes a range and you just say the step. Correct. Good. Interesting question. Again, not about the understanding of things, but about the API. You know, like if I wanted to just get 100%, you can just go here and use auto-completion. So I'm not sure that these kind of questions are the best ones, but nonetheless, they are interesting. Which modifiers should you add to the button to press the edit view? To present the edit view. Which modifier should you add to... to present, yeah, okay. Full screen cover is presented, not the destination. This one. So it's full screen cover is presented because you pass the binding, and because it's a binding, you need to use this syntax and not this one. And destination, that's not how it works. Like we just did it here. You can see that it's not destination or anything. You just open a closure and write inside the code that you want, the view that you want to show, basically. Exactly. So which code snippet removes an element from the names array? So under it, find it interesting that they are using this Swift trailing closure syntax. It's not like that. It's not trailing closure. It's a modifier. So it's a modifier. I mean, as far as I know, you are modifying. You get this. Yeah, you get the model that the iteration is happening on, correct? We can just check here because we just did it on the edit view. There is an on delete, and you get the indices. So you need to remove the indices. True. I thought, yeah, again, because I'm using a lot the point-free architecture, I kind of forget how these things work. But yeah, you get this one. Exactly, perfect. So that's this piece of the tutorial. Very nice. We can see how it looks already. So it's looking good, and we have learned a lot of things. Again, there are things that I wish they change a little bit. I think we found kind of a bug on this tutorial where they forgot to mention that we had to wrap a preview in a navigation view, but not a big deal. And I'm eager to see how they teach us how to use, how to pass data between views. Because right now we just hard-coded this data, this state, it's hard-coded here. It doesn't come from anywhere. So I'm eager to see how they explain that and the flow of data and the stuff, because it's one of the most complex things on SwiftUI, basically. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do it.